Candlelight flickering. A glamorous party. A woman 8 months pregnant stands at the front door, smiling sweetly, coldly, holding out an apron. Be a dear and lend a hand. You know where the kitchen is. Clara holds the appetizer tray. Her eyes search for Derek across the crowd. He sees her and deliberately looks away. Derek, breezy toned, social smile, my wife volunteered. She's tough, aren't you, babe? A dead silent moment. Clara, voice slightly trembling but every word razor clear, no. I did not want to. I was embarrassed, exhausted, and I was heartbroken, Derek. Franklin Holt, eyes locked on Derek, voice low as stone. That is not what she just said. Constance, cold, absolute. What happened tonight is not acceptable. Derek's face drains. The entire room holds its breath. A pregnant wife treated like a servant inside her own husband's family home until the billionaire guests stepped in and changed everything. The full story is right below, don't scroll past. The candles were already lit when Clara arrived. She could see them through the tall front windows of the Whitfield house. Dozens of them. White tapers in silver holders, casting that particular kind of light that made everything look warmer than it was. She stood on the stone path for one extra moment before she went in. She told herself it was because she needed to adjust her coat, but really she was looking at those candles, and she was trying to hold on to the version of the evening she had planned for herself on the drive over. The night air smelled of wood smoke and autumn, cold and clean against her face. Inside, the party was already going. She could hear the particular low hum of it, crystal glasses, voices at that careful party volume that was neither intimate nor loud, music somewhere in the back, a string quartet playing something she almost recognized. She breathed in once. She checked her reflection in the dark glass of the side window, the green dress, her hair, which had taken 40 minutes this morning to arrange and had stayed mostly arranged through the afternoon, her face, which looked like the face of a woman who was trying to look like she was not nervous. You look elegant, Derek had said when she came downstairs. He had said it without looking up from his phone. She had taken it anyway. She pressed the doorbell. Rosalind Whitfield opened the front door before the sound had finished. She was wearing something cream and structured, and she smelled of the same perfume she had worn for 30 years. Her hair was silver and perfectly placed. She was 63 years old and had spent 63 years learning exactly how to look like the most important woman in any room. And she was holding something out before the door was fully open. Clara looked at it, an apron, white linen, pressed flat and crisp, small embroidered roses stitched along the hem in pale gold thread, Rosalind's initials in the corner. An RW so carefully sewn it looked like it belonged on something you were not supposed to actually use. Rosalind was smiling. She always smiled. Be a dear, Rosalind said. Her voice was warm the way expensive marble is warm. The warmth was surface. The caterers are running behind. We need someone to circulate the appetizers. You know where the kitchen is. She was already turning away when she finished the sentence. She was already moving toward another guest before Clara had spoken a single word. Clara stood in the entrance of the house. The party hummed behind Rosalind's retreating back. The door was still open. November air pushed against Clara from behind. 8 months of pregnancy pressed against her ribs from the inside. Her ankles were swollen inside the low heels she had chosen because they were sensible and still made her feel like herself. She held the apron. She looked at Rosalind's initials. She looked at the kitchen doorway to her left. She looked across the room for Derek. He was already there. Across the room, drink in hand, back to her, laughing at something the man beside him was saying. His gray suit fit him well. He looked exactly like the kind of man who belonged at this kind of party. Easy in his skin. Easy in this room. She had watched him learn that easiness over 6 years and she had admired it. And she had told herself it was something they shared. She waited for him to turn. People who love each other can feel when the other person enters a room. She had read that once. She had believed it. He did not turn. She thought, I should say something. She thought, he will be embarrassed. She thought, maybe I am overreacting. This was the first thing Clara always did. Not anger. Not the clean recognition of something wrong. The search. The frantic practice search for the version of events where nobody meant anything bad by it. Where she could smooth it over and get through the evening and talk about it quietly in the car on the way home and it would not become a thing. She put on the apron. She reached around her belly to tie the strings at the back. The baby shifted at the awkward angle. A small interior complaint. She steadied herself with one hand on the doorframe. I know, she thought, I know. She walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was bright and warm and smelled of roasting garlic and something herbed. A young man in a black uniform was managing 3 silver trays at once and had the expression of someone whose evening had gone significantly sideways. His name badge said Todd in small black letters. He looked up when Clara appeared. Oh, thank God, he said. He said it like air releasing from a balloon. Can you take the bruschetta? Just walk the room. Hold the tray out. They will take things from it. You do not even have to say anything. Clara looked at the tray. The bruschetta was arranged neatly on white parchment. It smelled of olive oil and fresh basil and roasted tomato. She had not eaten since noon. She picked up the tray. She walked back into the party. The room was full in the way that expensive rooms with expensive guests are full. Clusters of conversation. Two men near the fireplace with the particular posture of men discussing money. Women in jewel colors grouped near the tall windows. Someone gesturing widely at a joke. The string quartet in the far corner playing something that no one was listening to, but everyone needed to be there. Clara moved slowly. She had learned to move slowly at 8 months. The tray was heavier than it looked. She kept her shoulders level and her face arranged, and she smiled when people reached toward her. Most of them did not look at her face. One man took 2 pieces of bruschetta without stopping his sentence to the man beside him. His fingers grazed the edge of her tray, and he did not register that there were hands beneath it. A woman in a red blouse pointed and said, "What is in those?" Clara told her. The woman wrinkled her nose and said, "Never mind," and turned back to her conversation. Clara kept walking. The baby moved again. A low, rolling motion. The movement that happened when her blood sugar was dropping. She had learned this particular signal over the past weeks. The baby's way of saying we need something. She passed Derek the first time near the fireplace. He was laughing. A real laugh, the one that used his whole face. He did not see her. She passed him the second time near the tall windows. This time he saw her. She watched his eyes travel to her, watched them find the tray, the apron, her face. She saw the information arrive, saw it process. He looked away, not quickly like a man who felt guilty and was trying to hide it. Slowly, with that particular kind of deliberateness that is almost its own statement. The deliberateness of a calculation completed. Clara stopped walking. The tray was very heavy, she thought. He sees me. She thought, he is not going to do anything. She thought, oh, that small sound, that interior sound that is not really a word and not really a sentence. Just the noise that the body makes when the mind finally admits something the heart has already known for a long time. It settled somewhere behind her sternum. Quiet and heavy and real, she kept walking. At the far edge of the room, near the tall windows that faced the back garden, a man stood alone. He was perhaps 65, perhaps a few years older. Silver-haired, solidly built. He wore a simple dark suit with no pocket square and no performance in his posture. He was not working the room. He was not circulating or gathering or performing engagement. He was simply watching. And as Clara passed him with her tray, he was the only person in the room who looked directly at her face when she offered the bruschetta. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, but he said them like he meant them. Like the words had actual weight and she was an actual person receiving them. Clara nodded. She moved on. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it later. And when she did, she would understand that the evening had already begun to change in that exact moment. She just could not feel it yet. Mirror moment. She walked that room the way you walk through a difficult dream. Putting one foot in front of the other. Telling yourself you are almost through it. Checking the exits with your eyes every few minutes. Not because you are planning to leave, but because you need to know the door is still there. She circled the room twice more. By the third pass, her lower back was a steady, dull fire. Her ankles felt like they belonged to someone else. She had been standing on marble floors in low heels for going on 45 minutes. She had not eaten since noon. The baby was asking, quietly and continuously, for something she was not getting. She walked back to the kitchen. She set the tray down on the counter. She pressed both palms flat against the cool surface and closed her eyes for one breath. Todd looked at her with something in his face that might have been guilt. "I am so sorry," he said. "The other 2 were supposed to be here by 7. "It is all right," Clara said. Automatic. Instant. The 2 words that lived in her mouth, so naturally she had stopped noticing she said them. It is all right. The sentence she had used for every late arrival and forgotten promise and small disappointment and large one, it is all right. The sentence that was supposed to mean acceptance, but had somewhere along the way started to mean surrender. She pressed one hand to the small of her back. She breathed. The kitchen smelled of warm things. Garlic and butter and something sweet underneath. It was the warmest room she had been in all evening. She stood there for 1 minute. She let herself be still. Then she picked up the tray. She went back into the room. By 8:15, Clara's feet had gone numb. Not from cold, from pressure. From standing on marble in heels for going on an hour while carrying a tray and a baby and the specific accumulated weight of a party that had not gone the way she planned. The numbness started in her toes and had risen slowly to her ankles. And she kept walking because stopping did not feel like an option. And she was not sure exactly when that had become true. She found a moment near the kitchen door. She set the tray on a small side table and pressed her palm against the small of her back. She breathed. She counted to 5. The string quartet was playing something she recognized now. A Vivaldi piece. Something from the Four Seasons. She had loved it once. She could not remember which season. She took out her phone. She typed, "I am circulating appetizers at Rosalind's party. 8 months pregnant. Derek is pretending he does not see me." 3 dots appeared. Then Bethany's response. "I need you to say that again." She typed. She handed me an apron at the door. I put it on. "I do not know why I put it on. Clara, I know." "Where is Derek?" 30 feet away, Clara typed. "Having a great time. Have you talked to him?" She looked across the room. Derek was nodding at something the man beside him was saying. His posture was easy, open, relaxed. He had the body language of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. "No," she typed. He looked at me. He saw the apron. He turned away. "That is your answer, honey. I know. Are you okay?" Clara looked at her ankles. She looked at the embroidered roses on the apron's hem. She looked at Rosalind, moving through her guests like warm water, fluid and luminous and completely at home. She looked at Derek. "Not really," she typed. She put the phone away. This was the part that she could not stop coming back to. Not Rosalind. She had made a kind of peace with Rosalind. The peace that was really surrender wearing acceptance coat. Rosalind was a fixed point. Rosalind had been this way since the beginning. Clara had a system for it. Smile. Deflect. Find one warm face in the room and orbit it for the evening. But Derek had kissed her cheek before they left the house tonight. He had said, "You look nice." In the car, he had put his hand on her belly for a moment, briefly, the way he did when he remembered to. She had felt a flicker of warmth at it, a small, stubborn reminder that there was something real between them. And then they had walked into his mother's house and he had simply evaporated. Not rudely. That was the thing that made it so hard. Not loudly. Not with any action she could point to as wrong. He had just stepped through the door and disappeared into the version of himself that existed in this house. The son, the regional director, the man who belonged here, and she had become invisible. She picked up the tray again. She moved back into the room. The silver-haired man was still near the windows, but now he was seated at a small table near the fireplace. Beside him sat a woman, 30s, dark hair pulled back simply. She was dressed plainly for a room like this, but wore the plainness the way very confident people wear things, like a choice, not a limitation. As Clara passed with the tray, the older man looked up at her again. He tracked her path across the room for a moment before returning to his conversation with the dark-haired woman. Clara noticed it. She did not think much of it. She was tired. Her back was a steady complaint. She was thinking about how much longer she could stay upright and whether anyone at this party would care if she sat down. She was wrong about not thinking much of it. He was thinking a great deal. His name was Franklin Holt. She did not know that yet. She would learn it, and when she did, a name she had seen in headlines would assemble itself at the back of her tired mind, a company name, an acquisition, the kind of numbers that did not feel real in ordinary life. He had started with nothing in Akron, Ohio, at the age of 22, and had spent 43 years turning nothing into something that required a staff of 40 just to manage. He had survived 4 recessions, 2 hostile takeovers, and 1 year of personal darkness after his wife died that he did not talk about to anyone except Constance. He had learned through all of it to read a room. He was reading this one, and what he was reading troubled him. The woman in the green dress, the very pregnant woman with the tray, had been on her feet since she arrived. He had watched her. He had watched the hostess, who moved through the room with warmth and attention for every guest, pass the woman in the green dress twice without acknowledging her. He had noticed the apron with someone else's initials. He had noticed the way she pressed her hand to her lower back when she thought no one was watching. He had noticed the man in the gray suit near the bar who had looked at her and then deliberately looked away. He said nothing yet. He was not a man who moved without understanding the full picture, but he was watching. His daughter, Constance, was watching him watch. "Dad," she said quietly. "I see it," he said. Breathing room. At 8:30, the caterers finally arrived. Todd looked like a man who had been pulled back from a ledge. 2 more people in black uniforms, carrying things from a van outside, filling the kitchen with efficient motion. Clara set down her tray. She stood beside the kitchen counter and she did something she had not done since she arrived. Nothing. She just stood there. The kitchen hummed around her. The smell of warm food. The sound of someone running water in the utility sink. The particular relief of not carrying something for 60 seconds. She put one hand on her belly. The baby was quiet. Still there, the baby seemed to say, "I know," Clara thought. "I know you are." She stood there for 1 full minute and breathed. Then the kitchen door swung open and Rosalind was there and the minute was over. "There you are, Clara. Warm. Easy." The social warmth so practiced it had almost become real. "I hope Todd hasn't been running you ragged. The Holts have arrived and I wanted to make sure you'd had a chance to freshen up before we do the introductions." Clara looked at her. "Franklin Holt," said the back of her mind. "Franklin Holt is the name," she said. "The Holts?" Clara said. Franklin Holt and his daughter, Rosalind, said. "Derek has been waiting to meet him properly." A pause. A fraction of recalibration. "You look tired, dear." Perhaps some water? Not a question. A directive aimed at making Clara's tiredness her own responsibility. I am fine, Clara said. The two words again. Automatic. She heard herself say them and thought distantly that she was so tired of those two words. Rosalind smiled and moved back into the party, and Clara stayed in the kitchen doorway and thought, Derek has been waiting to meet him. She thought about the last 45 minutes. She thought about the tray. She thought about the way Derek had looked at her and looked away. She thought, I have been serving the party that Derek needed to impress. I have been the help at the event he needed to look good at. The baby moved. She put her hand on her belly again. I know, she thought. I know. She went back into the room, near the far wall, past the cluster of women in jewel colors. There was a long sideboard with wine glasses and water glasses and small decorative objects that Clara had always found mildly oppressive. Expensive things arranged to be noticed. She moved toward it and set her empty hands against its edge and stood for a moment looking at the room. The room looked back without looking. This was a skill she had developed over 6 years of these parties. The ability to stand in a room full of Derek's people and be invisible. She had not cultivated it deliberately. It had grown up around her naturally, the way certain plants grow in whatever direction the light does not come from. She had become very good at taking up the minimum amount of space. Rosalind materialized nearby, speaking to a couple Clara did not know. Rosalind's hand found the woman's arm. Rosalind laughed at something. Real warmth this time. The warmth of a woman among her own people. Clara watched her. She had spent 6 years trying to become one of Rosalind's people. She understood now, standing at the sideboard with her feet aching, that this had never been a possibility. Rosalind had made her peace with who Clara was on the day Derek brought her home. She had made her peace, and she had arranged her life accordingly, and every interaction since then had been a management of that arrangement. The memories came the way they always did when she let her guard down, not as a flood, as small photographs, ordinary on their own, damning in sequence. A company dinner 2 years ago. She had worn a red dress. She had been genuinely having a good time, genuinely laughing at something the CFO's wife had said, and Derek's hand had found her arm. Light pressure, barely there. But the pressure meant quiet down. She had spent the rest of that evening quieter, smaller, safer. And Derek had driven home in a better mood, and she had told herself it was a good evening. His college roommate's wedding. She had been introduced to a circle of Derek's oldest friends, and she had extended her hand and smiled, and one woman in the circle, she realized much later, had been someone Derek dated for 3 years in his 20s. Clara had not known that when it happened. She had only known that something in the air around her was different from the air around Derek, that she was being assessed and found to be a particular kind of thing. She had asked Derek about it, gently in the car the next day, and he had said, what does it matter? She had let it go. Because what does it matter had become a sentence she used on herself more often than she used it on him. Oliver's kindergarten play. He had been 5 years old. He had worn a cardboard crown because he was playing a king. He had stood at the front of the stage with 9 other children in cardboard crowns, and he had said his 4 lines with the kind of total commitment that 5-year-olds bring to everything, and it had been the most important 4 lines Clara had ever heard in a theater. Derek had not come. He had texted from a late meeting. Clara had sat in the 3rd row with her phone in her lap, and she had filmed the whole thing. She had sent Derek the video immediately after. He had responded with a thumbs-up emoji. She had sat in the school parking lot afterward, Oliver asleep in the back seat, her face turned away from the rearview mirror, and she had cried, very quietly. The kind of crying that happens with the music turned up so a child does not hear. She had cried for Oliver's crown and for Derek's emoji and for the space between those two things that was supposed to be a marriage. That parking lot felt very close right now. She pressed her spine against the sideboard. The baby rolled. Slow and deliberate. The movement that said lately, I am getting too big for this space. I know, Clara thought back, me too. She put her hand on her belly just for a moment, just long enough to feel the solid realness of it. Whatever else this evening was, this was real. This was happening, this small person rolling under her hand, insisting on being acknowledged. I see you, she thought. She stayed there for a moment. Are you all right? Clara turned. The woman with the dark hair was standing in front of her, the one who had been sitting with the silver-haired man. Up close, she was perhaps 38. She had warm brown eyes and the expression of someone who asked questions she actually wanted the answers to. Not the party question that was not really a question, the real kind. I am fine, Clara said. Automatic. Instant. The woman looked at her with patient, open skepticism. She did not perform concern. She did not arrange her face. She simply looked. You have been on your feet for an hour, she said. You are 8 months pregnant. You are serving food. And you just pressed yourself against that sideboard like someone who needs to sit down very badly. Clara opened her mouth to say something reassuring. I am Constance, the woman said. She did not reach out her hand. She offered her name the way you offer someone something they actually need. I am not going to pretend I did not notice. Clara closed her mouth. Something shifted, very small, like a key turning in a lock that had been stuck for a long time. Clara, she said. Are you staff? Constance asked. She said it carefully, not unkindly, like someone asking a question that matters rather than a question that has an obvious answer. No, Clara said. I am Derek's wife. A pause. One beat. Derek, Constance said. The name flat in her mouth. Not a question, not a response. Just the name set down. The man in the gray suit, Clara said, near the bar. Constance looked across the room. Looked back at Clara. He knows you are serving? She said. Yes. Another pause, longer this time. Come sit down, Constance said. Not an invitation, an instruction. The kind of instruction that comes from someone who has decided that the situation requires action. I am all right, really, I do not need. Clara. The way she said it. Just the name. With the full weight of having heard Clara say I am all right and knowing exactly what that meant. Come, sit down, Constance said again, please. And Clara, who could not remember the last time someone had said please to her and meant it as care rather than transaction, felt something crack, very quietly, behind her sternum, like something that had been held rigid for a long time letting go by 1 degree. She followed Constance to the table by the fireplace. Mirror moment. She followed that woman across the room the way you follow the first person in a while who has actually asked how you are. Not carefully, not holding yourself at the usual distance, with something that felt uncomfortably close to relief. Franklin Holt looked up when they arrived. His eyes moved to Clara's face, not the apron, not the belly, her face. This is Clara, Constance said. She said it simply, with the ease of someone who makes introductions that matter. She is Derek Whitfield's wife. Franklin Holt looked at Clara for a long moment. He said, Franklin Holt. He offered his hand. His grip was brief and firm and real. Thank you for the bruschetta, he said. Earlier, you are welcome, Clara said. Beat. Then something assembled itself slowly at the back of her tired, aching mind. Franklin Holt. She turned the name over. A company name. A headline from months ago scrolled past on her phone during Oliver's swimming lesson. An acquisition number that had seemed abstract and enormous. The kind of number that happened to other people's worlds. She looked at him more carefully. He looked back, without any indication that he expected recognition or cared whether it came. How long until your due date? He asked. 5 weeks, she said. First baby. Second, I have a son. He is 6. Something crossed Franklin Holt's face. Warm and brief. My daughter was 6 when my wife got sick, he said. 6 is a good age, old enough to understand kindness. Clara did not know what to say to that. She said, yes, he is very kind. Then, because something about this man made pretending feel not just unnecessary but actually difficult, she said, he's the reason I do not fall apart. Franklin Holt looked at her steadily. Good, he said. Hold on to that. Breathing room. For a few minutes she just sat. The fireplace was warm. The seat beneath her was real. Someone brought a plate of food and set it near her without making anything of it, and she ate because she needed to eat, and nobody asked her to carry anything, and nobody looked past her to find someone more interesting. She ate, she breathed, the baby settled. Outside the windows, the November garden was dark and still. She had not sat down in over an hour. She had forgotten, somewhere in the middle of the evening, what it felt like to simply sit. Rosalind found her at the table. Of course she did. Rosalind had a particular instinct for exactly the moment when Clara had begun to feel steady again. Clara had noticed this over 6 years and had never been able to decide if it was deliberate or if Rosalind simply operated on a frequency that registered Clara's calm as an opportunity. Either way, the result was the same. Clara, there you are. The warmth, the practiced, polished warmth. I have been looking everywhere. The caterers need help with the main plates. Would you mind terribly? Constance's expression did not change, not a flicker. Franklin Holt took a slow sip of his water. Clara felt it. The familiar pull. The trained reflex towards smoothing and obliging and making it easier for everyone in the room except herself. Her hand was resting on the table. She pressed it flat against the tablecloth. Rosalind, she said, I am 8 months pregnant. I have been on my feet for over an hour. I need to sit. The sentence came out quietly, almost conversational. Rosalind's smile did not waver. Of course, she said, waving one hand. Just 5 minutes? The timing for the main course is— No, Clara said. The word surprised her as much as anyone in earshot. Not loud, not sharp, just present. Set down on the table like something that had always belonged there and had simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive. Rosalind blinked. One small blink. The only visible sign that something had not gone according to the arrangements. Well, she said. And then, recovering with the expertise of 63 years of social navigation, Franklin. Constance, I do hope you are enjoying the evening. She moved away. Constance watched her go. She did that with a smile, Constance said. She always does, Clara said. A short silence. And your husband? Constance said. Clara looked across the room. Derek had found them. She could tell by the angle of his body, the slight recalibration of a man who had spotted something that required management. He was moving toward the table, not hurried, not alarmed, with the deliberate ease of a man who had decided on his approach. "He is coming over," Clara said. She felt her chest tighten. Not fear. Something older and more complicated than fear. The anticipatory grief of a woman who already knows how a conversation is going to go. Who knows the script so well she could say his lines for him. Who still, somewhere small and stubborn and hopeful, wants to be wrong. She was learning to stop wanting to be wrong. Derek arrived. He brought his most pleasant voice, Clara, the voice that asked nothing of him and required something of her. "You doing okay? Did not know you had sat down. You saw me," she said. Simple, not an accusation. A statement of fact placed on the table beside his pleasantness. Derek laughed, aimed at the table, at the room, at the general air. "Franklin, great to actually meet you properly. Derek Whitfield." "And you must be, his wife needs to eat something," Constance said. She said it the way she said most things. Directly, without decoration, without apology. Derek paused, the charm recalibrated, a slight adjustment. He was good at this. She had always known he was good at this. "She is fine," he said. "Clara is tough. Aren't you, babe?" Babe. She had not heard him call her that in perhaps a year. It arrived now as a prop, not an endearment. A word deployed for an audience, the word that meant support me here. Clara thought, "I know what I see. I am not crazy, I know what I see." The caterers ran behind. Derek continued. He was addressing the table now, explaining, managing the narrative. Mom asked if Clara could help out for a bit. She was happy to. Was she? Franklin said. Not a question. 2 words, level and quiet. Derek looked at him. Franklin looked back. That quality of stillness. The look of a man who had encountered many self-performances in his life and had stopped finding them interesting decades ago. "I was not happy to," Clara said, very quietly. Derek turned to her. She held his gaze, she held it, and she did not look away first, and the effort of not looking away first was enormous, and she did it anyway. "I was not happy to," she said again. "I was embarrassed, I was tired, and she paused, choosing. I was sad, Derek." Sad was the wrong word. Sad was too small and too soft. But she had spent so many years learning to make her feelings fit inside words that would not alarm anyone, and sad was what came out. Derek's jaw tightened. "This is not the time," he said, low. A warning dressed as reason. "The time," Clara said, "would have been when your mother handed me an apron at the front door. The time would have been when you saw me carrying a tray across the room and looked away." A small silence settled over the table. It spread. The couple at the nearest table, who had been half listening in the unconscious way that party guests do, went still. "Clara," Derek said, quieter now, the warning underneath it sharpening. "I am not raising my voice," she said. "I am just saying what happened." She reached up and untied the apron. She did it carefully. Deliberately, she folded it once, then again. She set it on the table between them. "I am going to sit here," she said. "I am going to get something to eat, and then I am going to decide whether I want to stay or go home." She looked at him. "I would appreciate it," she said, "if you joined me." He did not. He said something low and clipped. Later, she would not remember the exact words. "I will talk to you later, or we will discuss this later, or something else in that register." And he walked away. The particular walk of a man who needs to be seen to be moving towards something rather than away. Clara watched him go. Her eyes stung. She blinked once. Hard. She was not going to cry here. She was not. Constance slid a plate in front of her. Real food, something warm. Clara did not look up to ask where it had come from. She just looked at it for a moment. "Eat," Constance said, simply, like it was the most obvious and necessary instruction in the world. Clara ate. Mirror moment. She ate, and she did not speak, and she did not try to fill the silence. She had spent years filling silences, making the air around Derek comfortable with her words and her softness and her careful management of the temperature of every room she shared with him. She had been the insulation in a house that was never quite stable. She ate. The food was warm. The fireplace beside her was warm. Constance was beside her, not speaking, not requiring anything. For a few minutes it was enough. She let it be enough. Breathing room. The fire crackled beside her. The party continued around them. People laughed and clinked glasses and told stories. The string quartet played through something long and unhurried. The candles on the tables had burned down by an inch. Clara ate. She breathed. She let the warmth of the fireplace reach her back, which she needed badly, and she did not think about Derek for a full 4 minutes. She thought about Oliver instead. Oliver in his pajamas right now, probably. At home with the sitter. Probably already asleep. Curled with his knees pulled up the way he had slept since he was an infant. His dark hair on the pillow, his breath slow and even. He would ask about the party in the morning. He always asked. She would say it was fine. She was going to stop saying that, she thought. She was going to stop saying things were fine when they were not. She was going to stop that, starting with herself, and then moving outward. She pressed her hand briefly to her belly. "Both of you," she thought. "For both of you, at 9 o'clock. Clara excused herself. She moved through the party with the careful deliberateness of a woman who was holding herself together by concentrating on one step at a time. The fireplace to the hallway to the left, past the framed photographs that she had never once been asked for an opinion about, past the table with the orchid Rosalind maintained as a symbol of something, to the powder room at the end of the hall. She went inside and locked the door. The room was small, white subway tile, good light over the mirror, a candle on the corner of the sink that smelled of something expensive and clean. It was the kind of powder room that had been arranged for admiration rather than use, and she had always found it oddly appropriate that Rosalind's bathroom was a performance too. She stood in front of the mirror. She looked at herself for a long moment, the green dress. Her hair, which had started the evening carefully arranged and had now admitted its true feelings about the evening. The face of a woman who was 31 years old and tired in a way that sleep would not fix. She thought, this is what I have been doing. She thought, I have been doing this for years. She put both hands on the edge of the sink. She felt it then, a tightening, low across her abdomen, not sharp, not alarming, but real and present and insistent. She had been having Braxton Hicks contractions for 3 weeks. She knew the feeling. She breathed through it. It passed. She counted the seconds it had lasted. 22 seconds. She straightened. She looked at herself in the mirror again. There was something in her face that she did not recognize right away. It took her a moment to identify it. It was anger. Not the performed version. Not the managed, carefully channeled, made polite and reasonable version she had been working with her whole adult life. The real version. The hot, clear, burning thing that had been building quietly since the moment Rosalind's door opened and the apron appeared. She had put on the apron. That thought came back to her now, standing in the powder room. Not the fact of the apron. The choice. She had chosen to put it on. Nobody had forced her. Rosalind had handed it to her and turned away, and Clara had stood there with every possible response available to her, and she had chosen the one that required her to make herself smaller. She had chosen it because of Derek's face, because of the fear of his face, because she had spent 6 years learning the precise dimensions of the space his comfort required her to occupy, and she had been so good at staying inside those dimensions that she had forgotten they were a cage. She gripped the edge of the sink. The anger was not performing itself. It was not making noise. It was simply there, underneath everything, steady as a pulse. She pulled out her phone. She called Bethany. It rang twice. "Clara, I need to tell you something," Clara said, "and I need you to just listen. Can you do that?" "Yes, I am here." "I put on the apron," Clara said. "I put it on because I did not want to make a scene, because I was afraid of what Derek's face would do if I said no in front of his mother." She paused. "I put it on and I carried a tray across a room full of people for an hour while my husband watched and said nothing, silence on the line. Bethany's particular quality of silence. The kind that meant I am here, and I am listening with my whole self. And the worst part," Clara said, "is that I kept telling myself it was fine. I kept thinking I was overreacting. I kept looking for the version of this where nobody meant anything bad by it." Her voice was steady. She noticed that it was steady. The anger underneath her was not making her voice shake. It was making it very clear. "And then I thought about Oliver," she said. She stopped. She put one hand on the mirror. "I thought about him watching me do that someday. Watching me carry somebody else's apron because I was afraid to say no." She took a breath. "Or worse. I thought about this baby watching me do it, growing up and learning to do it herself, shrinking because she sees me shrink, apologizing for existing because her mother spent a whole party doing exactly that." She felt the tightening again, deeper this time. She breathed through it. "Clara," Bethany said. Her voice changed, sharpened. "How often are you having those?" "What? I can hear you breathing through something. How often?" "Braxton Hicks," Clara said. "I have been having them for weeks." "How far apart?" "Bethany, far apart." A pause. "I do not know," Clara said. "I have not been timing them." "Start timing right now," Bethany said. "Are you sitting?" "I am in the powder room." "Sit on the floor." "I am not sitting on the floor of Rosalind Whitfield's powder room." "Clara," one word. The same way Constance had said her name, with the full weight of having heard enough. Clara sat on the floor. The tile was cold against the back of her dress. Cold and smooth and real in a way almost nothing this evening had been real. She felt the chill of it through her dress, and it was oddly grounding. Present. Actual. "I am on the floor," she said. "Good now. What you said about Oliver and the baby, write that down somewhere before you forget it." "That was important, I know," Clara said. "I know you know," Bethany said. "But I want you to write it down anyway." Clara opened her notes app with one thumb. She typed it. Short, just the essential thing. She did not want her daughter to learn to shrink because she saw me shrink. She put her phone back to her ear. "Do you love him?" Bethany said. "Oliver, Derek." A long pause. Outside the powder room door, the party continued. A burst of laughter from somewhere. The quiet ongoing notes of the string quartet. "I loved who I thought he was," Clara said. "I built a version of him out of the good moments. I kept the good moments very close. I needed them to make sense of everything else. Clara. I know. How long have you known? Bethany asked. How long have you actually known? Clara closed her eyes. She sat on the cold tile floor of Rosalind's powder room, 31 years old, 8 months pregnant, wearing an apron she had now untied and folded and set on the table in front of her husband, and she thought about how long she had known. She thought about the parking lot after Oliver's play. She thought about the farmer's market where she and Derek had actually met, which he had transformed into a work conference when he introduced her to his friends. She thought about every party she had spent in a room full of his people, feeling like a piece of furniture that did not quite match the rest of the room. Long enough, she said. Are you going to be okay? Yes, Clara said. She meant it differently than she had meant it before. Not the it is all right kind of okay. Something more solid, more permanent. She timed the next tightening, 8 minutes since the last one. She called Dr. Aldridge's answering service. Mirror moment. She sat on that cold floor and she thought about all the other cold floors, figuratively. The parking lots and the quiet car rides and the evenings she had spent staring at the ceiling waiting for sleep and thinking, this is fine, this is manageable, this is what marriage is. The effort of sitting in discomfort and calling it normal. The energy she had spent every single day making normal out of something that was not. The tile was cold. It was real. She put her hand on her belly. Real, she thought. This is real. All of this is real. She did not look away from that. The answering service connected her to a nurse. Clara explained the situation. The nurse asked questions in the calm, efficient way of someone who had taken many calls from worried pregnant women in powder rooms, or perhaps not in powder rooms. Perhaps this was a first. The nurse said, if they are fewer than 5 minutes apart, go to the hospital. If they are between 5 and 10 minutes apart, call back. Continue timing. Clara timed. 8 minutes. She stood up from the floor. She washed her hands. She looked at herself in the mirror one more time. Then she unlocked the door and walked back into the party. The party was still happening. That was always the strange thing about moments that changed something. The world kept going around them. People were still laughing. The string quartet was still playing. Rosalind was still moving through her guests with her particular brand of warmth. Clara moved back toward the fireplace table. Franklin Holt saw her coming before she arrived. She could tell because his posture changed slightly. The readying of attention. She sat down. You were a while, Constance said. Not an accusation, just the observation of someone who had noticed. I was timing contractions, Clara said. Constance's attention sharpened immediately. How far apart? 8 minutes, Clara said. Probably still Braxton Hicks. My OB's answering service says to monitor. Have you eaten? Constance asked. Yes, you fed me. A small thing crossed Constance's face. Something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. Have you told your husband? She said. Clara looked across the room. Derek was still near the bar. He had found a new cluster of people. He was talking with his hands, the way he did when he was excited about something. He looked like a man having the best evening of his year. She had tried to call him. The call had gone to voicemail. I tried, she said. Franklin Holt put his water glass down with a sound that was quiet but deliberate. He stood. He said, excuse me, to no one in particular and to both of them simultaneously, and he moved across the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who moved through spaces at his own tempo and expected the spaces to accommodate it. Margot Ellison appeared from somewhere near the edge of the room. She was 58. Silver-streaked hair cut cleanly at her jaw. She wore a dark blazer and the expression of a woman who had climbed every ladder she had been told she could not touch and had stopped finding the view surprising. She had been at this party for 2 hours and had said very little to anyone because she had been watching. She sat down in the chair Franklin had vacated. I have been watching you all evening, she said to Clara. Direct, without preamble. Clara looked at her. I am Margot Ellison, she said. I have been Franklin's business partner for 18 years, and I want to tell you something. All right, Clara said. What happened tonight was not unusual, Margot said. What I mean by that is I have seen this before. Not this exact room, not these exact people, but this. She gestured with one hand, a small and comprehensive gesture that meant all of it. Women who are made to feel small in rooms where they should have been welcomed. Women who carry things they should not have to carry because nobody around them is willing to pick up the weight. Women who sit on the outside of a room wondering when they became invisible. Clara looked at her. The fire crackled beside them. I was that woman, Margot said. For a long time, I was very efficient at carrying things, very good at being useful, and very, very quiet about what it cost me. Clara said nothing. She was not sure she needed to. You said no to her tonight, Margot said. When Rosalind came to the table, you said no. I did, Clara said. Did it feel as enormous as it looks from the outside? Clara considered it. Yes, she said, but not in the way I expected. It felt enormous and also small, simple, like I had been making it harder than it needed to be. Margot nodded slowly. Across the room, Clara could see Franklin Holt. He had reached Derek. He had tapped Derek on the shoulder. Derek had turned with his full social attention assembled, and then something had shifted in his face. She was too far away to hear what was being said, but she could see the shift. She watched Derek's eyes find her across the room. Mirror moment. She watched him look at her, and she thought about how many times in 6 years she had looked across a room hoping he would see her, actually see her. Not the performance of her, not the useful version of her, not the manageable version. Just her. She thought, he is seeing me now. She thought too late. Then she thought, it is not about too late. It is about right now. And right now she was sitting beside a fireplace at a party she had been handed an apron at, 8 months pregnant, having contractions she needed to time, and she was surrounded by strangers who had treated her with more basic human decency in 90 minutes than she had received from her own family this entire evening. That was worth noticing. She noticed it. Meanwhile, Franklin Holt was in the kitchen. He had found Rosalind there, managing the service of the main course with a quiet authority that reminded him of certain people he had worked with over the years. The kind who arranged things so the credit accumulated to them and the discomfort distributed to everyone else. "Rosalind," he said, pleasantly, the voice of a man who had no investment in her good opinion. She turned, her full attention, her full warmth, assembled and directed. "Franklin, are you enjoying? Your daughter-in-law has been on her feet since she arrived," he said. "She is 8 months pregnant. She had not eaten since noon. I have been in this room for 2 hours." Rosalind's smile adjusted, a fraction of a degree cooler. "Clara is very capable." "That is not what I said," Franklin said. A pause. "She is family," he said. "She is carrying your grandchild. And she spent the first hour of this evening serving bruschetta in your apron." He said it without heat, without judgment, just the facts, assembled and presented. Rosalind was a woman who had won every social confrontation of her adult life through the precise weaponization of tone. She had no weapon for a man who had no investment in her approval and enough context to not need her goodwill. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully. "But family relationships are complex," he said. "Yes, I understand that. I am not asking about your relationship with her. I am telling you what I observed." A pause. "I have been thinking," Franklin said, "about whether to continue the conversation with your son about the partnership proposal. Watching how a man treats his family tells you a considerable amount about how he operates in a business arrangement." Rosalind went very still, the stillness of a woman who had just felt the floor shift under her. "That is a private matter," she said. "Yes," Franklin agreed. "So is a woman serving food at her own family gathering while pregnant. And yet here we both are." He excused himself with a brief nod. He found Margot. She was already with Clara. He looked at them across the room for a moment before he went to find Derek. Breathing room. Outside the windows, the garden was dark and still. The November night pressed against the glass. The candles on the tables had burned another inch lower. The string quartet had moved into something slower, something in a minor key that suited the tail end of a party. The room felt different than it had at 8 o'clock. Clara did not know exactly why. She only knew that when she looked around the room now, the party looked different to her than it had when she arrived. Not smaller, not larger, just more visible. The arrangements that had always been there, more visible. She pressed her hand to her belly. 7 minutes since the last one, she noted. She would go to the hospital soon. She understood this with calm certainty. She was ready. Franklin Holt crossed the room with the unhurried stride of a man who moved at his own speed and was not watching anyone's face to see if he had permission. He found Derek Whitfield near the bar, mid-story, one hand raised for emphasis, surrounded by 3 people who were giving him the specific attention that Derek Whitfield had spent his whole adult life organizing his life to receive. Franklin tapped him on the shoulder. Derek turned, recognized him, assembled his finest version of himself instantly. "Franklin, I have been meaning to come find you all evening." "Your wife may be in labor," Franklin said, quietly, so the people beside Derek did not hear, but clearly, with no ambient kindness cushioning the words. Derek's face changed. The social version of Derek evaporated. Underneath it, briefly, was something that looked like the actual man. The man who could be alarmed, the man who could be reached. "She said it was Braxton Hicks," Derek said. "She gets them. She has been having contractions every 8 to 12 minutes, Franklin said, "for the last hour, while she was serving your mother's guests." He paused. "And you did not answer when she called." Derek looked across the room. Clara was sitting by the fireplace, one hand on her belly, her face calm in the particular way faces are calm when someone has decided to stop waiting for help and started managing on their own. Something moved through Derek's face. Not a simple thing. Nothing in a face that has done 6 years of something is simple. It might have been shame. It might have been fear. It might have been the beginning of understanding what it looks like when the person you have been counting on to manage their own disappointment finally stops. "I will take her," Derek said. "Yes," Franklin said, "you will." Clara saw Derek cross the room toward her. She saw the set of his shoulders, the purposeful stride, problem-solving body language. She stood before he reached her. Not to greet him, not to make it easier. She stood because she was done waiting for someone else's hand to help her rise. She smoothed her dress. She looked around the table. At Constance beside her. At Margot, who had returned to their circle. At Franklin Holt arriving from across the room. "Do you want me to come with you?" Constance asked, low, so Derek did not hear. Clara looked at her. This woman she had met 90 minutes ago in a room full of strangers, who had sat with her and fed her, and said things that were true and direct and expected nothing in return except her honesty. "I have someone who will meet me," Clara said, "my friend. She is already on her way." Constance nodded. "Take my number," she said. They exchanged phones, quick and certain, and gave them back. "Clara," Constance said. She held her eyes for a moment. What happened tonight was not acceptable. 3 words. Just 3 words. Not acceptable. Clara had heard a great many things in 6 years. She had heard reasonable explanations. She had heard she was too sensitive and she was overreacting, and these things were complicated. She had heard, "You know how she is and you know how I get," and it was just one night. Clara. She had never heard someone look at what had happened and say simply, without performance or apology, "Not acceptable." She felt it land, deep, behind the ribcage. Like something she had been trying to say for a long time had finally been said out loud by someone else, and hearing it from the outside made it real in a way that it had never quite managed to be from the inside. "I know," she said. Derek arrived. "Car is out front," he said. His hand found her elbow. The gesture that could look like tenderness from a distance. She felt it as direction. "One moment," she said. She turned to Margot Ellison. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "I do not know if you remember. We met briefly at the autumn luncheon." Margot looked at her steadily. "I remember you," she said. "I want to thank you," Clara said, "and Mr. Holt," for she paused, choosing with care, "for seeing me this evening." Margot was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, people who actually see you have always been the ones worth keeping." Clara felt her eyes sting. She blinked once. She held it. She turned to Derek. "All right," she said. "Let us go." Mirror moment. She walked through the party for the last time, and she felt the room in a way she had not felt it on the way in. On the way in, she had been trying to disappear into it. On the way out, she was simply moving through it, not invisible, not performing, not managing anyone's comfort except her own. She passed Rosalind near the kitchen doorway. Rosalind's expression was unreadable in the way that things are unreadable when they contain too much to show at once. Clara had spent years learning the vocabulary of Rosalind's face. What she saw there now was not guilt. It was the expression of a woman running a calculation, a recalculation. Clara did not stop. At the front door, she paused. She looked back across the room. Franklin Holt was near the fireplace. He caught her eye across the party. He nodded. A small thing, 1 degree of movement. But she felt it like a hand on her shoulder. She walked out. Breathing room. The November night was cold and clean and real. She stood on the front step and took one full breath. The air smelled of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. The garden was dark and still. The sound of the party came muffled through the closed door behind her. She could hear the string quartet one last time, and then it faded. And then all she could hear was the night. She breathed, her back ached, her feet ached. The baby was quiet now in that particular settled way that Clara had come to understand as presence rather than absence. Paying attention. She thought, "I am still here." She thought, "I walked through that room for an hour carrying a tray and I am still here." She thought, "Oliver is asleep at home. Tomorrow morning I will wake up and I will make him toast and he will tell me about his dream and I will listen to every word. I am still here." Derek brought the car around. She got in. The leather seat was cool. She leaned her head back. Derek drove. She did not fill the silence. She had been filling silences her whole marriage. Reasonable explanations. Gentle reassurances. The careful thermal management of a relationship that ran cold. She had been the insulation in a house that was never quite stable. Not tonight. Tonight the silence was hers. She let it be hers. Outside the car windows, the city moved past. Street lights, late traffic, ordinary November. She watched it go, and she thought about nothing in particular. And she timed the contractions, and she breathed through each one, and she thought, "I am almost on the other side of something. I do not know the name of it yet, but I am almost through." 6 minutes, she called Bethany. "I am on my way to the hospital," she said when Bethany picked up. "I am already driving," Bethany said. That was all. That was enough. Bethany was in the hospital parking lot when they arrived. She appeared between the parked cars like something Clara had willed into existence. Dark curls, the same coat she had been wearing for 5 years. The expression of a woman whose love was made of practical things. She was walking toward the car before it had fully stopped, and she looked at Clara through the windshield with the focused calm of a person who has already decided what the situation requires. Clara got out of the car. Bethany hugged her, brief and real. The kind of hug that says, "I am here and I am not going anywhere and you do not have to explain anything." "I have you," she said. Derek got out on the other side. Bethany looked at him. He looked back. "I have got her," Bethany said. "I am her husband," Derek said. "I know," Bethany said. "I have got her." The thing in his face at that moment. Clara would think about it later, in the quiet of the hospital room, and in the days after that. It was not a simple thing. It was the face of a man who had arrived late at something important and found it already handled. The face of a man who had assumed he would be needed and found out he had already been replaced in the need by someone who simply showed up. It was not the worst thing she had ever seen in his face, but it was the clearest. Inside the labor and delivery wing was all bright overhead lights and efficient movement, the smell of antiseptic and something warmer underneath. Nurses in soft-soled shoes, a whiteboard with names and room numbers. The particular calm of a place that handled urgent things without drama, because drama was not useful here. Dr. Aldridge arrived within 20 minutes. She had the direct, unhurried quality of a woman who had been delivering babies for 27 years and had seen enough to know what warranted concern and what warranted presence. She examined Clara. She looked at the contraction monitor. She said, "This is early labor, triggered by physical exertion and stress. We are 3 weeks early, but your baby's lungs are developed. We are going to support this and see where it goes." She paused. She looked at Clara over the top of her glasses. "You have been on your feet for how long?" 2 hours, Clara said. "Approximately. Eating?" "Not until 9 o'clock. I ate at 9. Dr. Aldridge wrote something on her chart. "You are going to be fine," she said. "Both of you." "I know," Clara said. She said it simply, not as reassurance, as information. She meant it that way. Derek sat in the chair by the window. He was present in the physical sense. He answered the nurses when they asked him things. When Clara allowed it, he held her hand. She allowed it sometimes. She was not yet ready to know what that meant. She was not going to figure out what anything meant tonight. Tonight was not a night for figuring things out. It was a night for getting through. Bethany sat in the chair on the other side of the bed. She had her coat pulled around her. Her shoes were still on. She had her phone in her lap, but she was not looking at it. Between contractions, Clara looked at her. Bethany met her eyes. Nothing needed to be said. Breathing room. The hospital room was quiet in the pauses. The monitor beeped its steady commentary. Someone in the hallway pushed a cart past the door. The overhead light was steady and neutral. Clara lay in the bed and she thought about the green dress she had chosen with care. The 40 minutes on her hair. The version of herself she had dressed for at the beginning of this evening, who had stood in front of the mirror feeling something close to hopeful. That version of herself was still here, she thought. She was not gone. She was just on the other side of something. She was the same person who had stood in front of that mirror, and she was also, in some way she could not fully name yet, different. As if the evening had pressed on something and the pressing had changed the shape of it. Not broken. Changed. She thought I said no. She thought I said it quietly, and it was real. She thought, I sat on the floor of a bathroom and I timed my contractions and I called Bethany and I told the truth. She thought, I looked Franklin Holt in the eye and I told the truth. Small things. They had all been small things. But small things, accumulated over an evening, had changed the shape of something she had been carrying for years. Mirror moment. The monitor beeped. She breathed through a contraction. Bethany's hand was somewhere nearby, not holding on, just present. Available, this, Clara thought. This is what it feels like to be held without being managed. She understood the difference now. She understood it in a way that could not be undone. At 2:17 in the morning, her daughter was born. 5 pounds and 9 ounces. 3 weeks early and already annoyed about it. A full head of dark hair. The loudest, most complete complaint Clara had ever heard from something so new to the world. She held her. She looked at the small, furious, total face of her daughter. Everything around her went quiet in the way that everything goes quiet when something new is actually happening. The room was still there, the monitor and the lights and Dr. Aldridge at the edge of the room writing things down, and Bethany with her fist pressed against her mouth and her eyes full. All of that was still there, but it was quiet underneath. Hey, Clara said, softly, I see you. The baby blinked, dark eyes unfocused, taking in the impossible brightness of the world for the first time. Clara held her tighter. She thought about Constance, who had offered food and her number and the word unacceptable. In that order, all of them necessary. She thought about Margot Ellison, who had said the people who actually see you are the ones worth keeping. She thought about a man in a dark suit who had looked at her face and said, thank you, as if the words had weight. She thought about Oliver at home, asleep, who would meet his sister in the morning. She looked at her daughter. Hey, she said again, I have got you. 3 days later, Constance Holt sent flowers, not the hospital kind, not the dutiful arrangement that arrives because someone added you to a gift list. A real bunch of things, eucalyptus and white roses and lavender. The smell of them reached Clara from across the room. A note in Constance's handwriting for you, not for the room. Clara put them on the windowsill where she could see them from the bed. 2 days after that, at a reasonable morning hour, her phone showed a name she had saved from Constance's phone that night. Franklin Holt, she answered. I heard, he said. A daughter. 5 weeks early, Clara said, and already opinionated. Good, he said. She will need that. Pause. I wanted to ask, he said, whether you had people around you. People helping. Clara looked at Bethany. Bethany was asleep in the chair by the window, pulled sideways with her coat over her like a blanket and her shoes still on. She had driven to the hospital on a Tuesday night, and she had not gone home. She had fallen asleep in that chair and woken up in it, and fallen asleep again, and she was still there. Yes, Clara said. I do. Good, Franklin said. I am glad. A pause then, Mr. Holt, she said. What you said to Derek, what you did that night. I said what was true, he said. That is usually enough. It helped, she said. I want you to know that it helped. He was quiet for a moment. She waited. He was not a man who rushed into the space that quiet made. My wife, he said finally. She spent 20 years building other people up. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and remembered everyone's name. Not as a performance, because she was genuinely interested in people. She never made a fuss. She just kept going, kept giving. He stopped. Clara did not say anything. When she got sick, he continued, you know what she told me? She said she wished she had made more fuss, not less. He paused. I think about that a lot. I am sorry you lost her, Clara said. So am I, he said. But she taught Constance well, and Constance has her eyes. So I do not really lose her entirely. He cleared his throat. The small sound of a man who has said more than he planned. Take care of yourself, Clara. I will, she said. I mean it now. I know you do, he said. I could tell. He said goodbye. She set the phone on the blanket. She looked at her daughter in the bassinet. She looked at the flowers on the windowsill. She thought about what she had texted Bethany from inside Rosalind's party. I do not know why I put it on. I do know, she thought now. She knew exactly why. She had put it on because she had learned, through years of small surrenders that had each seemed reasonable at the time, that keeping the peace was her job, that the discomfort of others was her responsibility to absorb, that making herself smaller was a kindness she was expected to offer, and that offering it had become so automatic she had stopped noticing she was doing it. She had believed the story she was given. Most women do. Mirror moment. She sat in the hospital bed with her daughter sleeping nearby, and she thought about all the small moments that had built up to the apron, all the parking lots and quiet car rides and evenings she had spent in rooms full of Derek's people, feeling like something that did not belong. All the time she had smoothed things over and told herself she was overreacting. She thought, I was not overreacting. She thought, I never was. She looked at her daughter. I am going to tell you the truth, she said quietly. Always, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. The baby slept. Breathing room. The hospital room was quiet. The flowers on the windowsill moved slightly in the warm air from the vent. Bethany breathed slowly in the chair. Derek, who had gone home the night before to check on Oliver and the sitter, would come back this morning. She did not know yet what she was going to say to him. She knew she was going to say something. She was not going to smooth it over. She was going to say the thing she had been trying not to say for years, in whatever words it needed, and she was going to say it clearly, and she was going to mean it. She did not need to know all the details of what came next. She just needed to know she would not put the apron on again. She would not. 6 weeks later, Clara moved out. Not dramatically. Not in the movie way, where someone packs a bag in a rage and slams a door. In the real way, which was more complicated and slower and involved, calls with a lawyer and a conversation with Oliver that took 2 hours and required honesty and simplicity, and the particular kind of courage it takes to explain adult failure to a 6-year-old who deserves the truth without the weight of it. Oliver sat on his bed with his knees pulled up. He listened the way he always listened to important things, with his full attention and his mouth slightly open. When Clara finished, he thought for a moment. Then he said, will we still have our toast mornings? Yes, Clara said. Always. That never changes. Okay, he said, and he went back to his Legos. She had always underestimated him. He had always been the steadier of the two of them. She moved into an apartment 2 miles from the old house, ground floor. Small garden that was mostly winter mud right now, but would be something in spring. A kitchen with a window that let the morning light in at a particular angle, warm and directional and real. Room for Oliver's bike in the storage closet. A second bedroom that was small but had a window that faced east and a closet big enough for the things a child accumulates. She named her daughter Rose, for no complicated reason. Because she was small and fierce and she was growing regardless of whether conditions were ideal. Because roses did that. Because Clara had been reading about roses once, when she was pregnant, and had thought, that is a thing I admire. And she had filed it away somewhere. She did not know she was keeping it. Bethany came to help her unpack. They ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor because the table was not assembled yet and neither of them cared. This is the best meal I have had in years, Bethany said. Clara laughed. She could not remember the last time she had laughed that easily. The kind of laugh that came from the chest without asking permission first. It really is, she said. She thought about Rosalind's party sometimes. She thought about it the way you think about the moment right before something changed. Not with anger, not with the particular bitterness that can harden around a wound if you are not careful. With something more useful. Clarity. She had walked into that party believing her discomfort was her responsibility to manage. She had walked out understanding that the people who arrange your discomfort and call it the natural order of things are counting on you to believe it. She had believed it for a long time. She did not anymore. Mirror moment. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been at the beginning of that evening. Standing on the stone path, looking at the candles through the window, straightening her coat, checking her reflection in the dark glass, trying to hold on to the version of the evening she had planned. She did not blame that woman. That woman had been doing the best she could with what she knew. She had been managing something very difficult with the tools she had available. And the tools she had available were the tools she had been given by years of learning to make herself fit into a space that was not the right shape for her. She had been her own warden. The door had been unlocked for a long time. She just had not known it. The divorce process was real and grinding and full of paperwork. And her lawyer was excellent and very expensive, and she was managing because she had to manage. And because it turned out she was better at managing her actual life than she had been at managing the performance of a life that was not hers. She had called Margot Ellison, a cold call, through professional channels, because Margot had mentioned a nonprofit she sat on the board of, and Clara's background was in nonprofit administration, and she had spent enough time telling herself she had nothing to offer that she had decided, sitting on the floor of the hospital room with Rose sleeping in her arms, that she was going to stop that. She had nothing to lose by asking. Margot had taken the call in 30 seconds. I was wondering when you would call, Margot had said. Coffee the following Tuesday. It was the beginning of something. Clara did not know exactly what yet. She was learning to be comfortable with not yet, with the space before the next thing. The open space that used to feel like falling and had started slowly to feel like standing. She had spent so many years needing everything to be certain and safe and arranged. She had organized her whole life around the avoidance of uncertainty. The result had been a very controlled, very managed, very quiet kind of unhappiness. The uncertainty she lived in now was real. It was also hers. On Rose's 6-week birthday, Clara put her daughter in the pram and walked to the small park 2 blocks from the apartment. The October morning was cool and clear and bright, in the way that October sometimes is, unexpectedly, like the year deciding to be beautiful one more time before winter. The trees along the path were turning, gold and orange and the deep red of something that knows how to end well. Oliver ran ahead on the path. He checked back periodically. He had always done this. Even when he was 2 and she took him to playgrounds, he would run ahead and then circle back to make sure she was still there, making sure the anchor held before he went any further. She had always found it one of the most loving things she had ever seen. Clara walked slowly. Rose was asleep in the pram, her small fist near her mouth. Her face the particular expression of newborn sleep that looked like wisdom even though it was just peace. Clara thought about what she would tell them someday, both of them. Not the version that made her a victim and Derek a villain, and the whole thing a cautionary tale about the wrong choices. That version was too easy and too narrow, and it left out the most important truth, which was that she had not been a victim of Derek, so much as she had been a participant in a story she had been telling herself for years. The real version. The version where she was a woman who had made reasonable choices with the understanding she had at the time, who had stayed longer than she should have because she believed in the promise of something, because she was afraid of the unknown, because she had a child and then another child, and because leaving seemed to require a certainty she had not felt until the night she sat on a cold tile floor and timed her own contractions and understood, finally, that certainty was not coming, that she was going to have to move without it. The version where she was a woman who had stood in a hallway one night holding an apron and had chosen to put it on because she was afraid, and then 2 hours later sat on that same hallway's powder room floor and understood that she did not have to be afraid of that anymore. The apron was not the problem. The apron was just the moment the problem finally had a face. She had been her own warden. The door had been unlocked for a long time. She pushed the pram along the path. The trees turned overhead. The morning was cold and clean, and she could feel it on her face, and it was real and present and hers. Oliver came running back from somewhere ahead on the path. He had something in his hand. "Mom," he said, "look at this." He held it up. A stick. A good one. She could tell even before she looked closely. A stick with genuine character. The curve of it and the weight of it and the particular texture of bark that had weathered something interesting. She took it from him. She examined it with her full and complete attention. "This is an excellent stick," she said. Oliver's face was the face of a child who has been seen. "I thought so too," he said. He took it back and ran off again. Breathing room. She pushed the pram slowly along the path, and she listened to the sound of leaves in the cold air and the distant sound of Oliver, somewhere ahead on the path, and the near sound of Rose breathing. She thought of Franklin Holt on the phone. His wife wished she had made more fuss. Not less, Clara intended to. Not loudly, not angrily, not as performance, and not as revenge, and not for anyone's approval or understanding, just more fuss. For the real things. For the things that deserved the fuss. For the ground floor apartment with the garden that would be something in spring. For the morning light through the kitchen window at the angle she had never thought to want. For the toast mornings and the interesting sticks and the small sleeping face of Rose, who was growing regardless of conditions. For Margot Ellison and her clear eyes and the coffee that was already turning into something. For Bethany, who had been in that parking lot before she even called. For Constance, who had sat down beside her and said simply, "Come, sit down, please." For the old man in a dark suit who had looked at her face and said, "Thank you," like the words had weight. For all the people who had seen her. The people who saw you, she thought. Those are the ones worth keeping. She stopped the pram for a moment. She leaned down and looked at her daughter. Rose was awake, dark eyes open. Taking in the October light through the pram's shade, the moving leaves overhead, the face of the person who had said, "Hey, I see you," before she was 12 minutes old. Clara smiled. "Good morning," she said. Rose blinked. Clara straightened. She looked ahead on the path. Oliver was circling back again. She could see him between the trees, coming back the way he always did, making sure the anchor held. She thought about the woman she was becoming. Not finished, not certain, not in possession of any of the things she had once thought she needed in order to feel safe. Just moving forward. Just here. Just herself. Final mirror moment. She had walked into that party in a green dress. Hoping, she walked out of this park in an ordinary coat, knowing. The hope had not gone. It had changed shape. It no longer needed someone else to hand it to her. It did not need Derek's approval, or Rosalind's acceptance, or any party's invitation. It lived in the apartment with the east-facing window. It lived in the toast mornings and the interesting sticks. It lived in the 6-week-old person in the pram who had arrived 3 weeks early, impatient, loudly announcing her presence. She had not been waiting for it. She had been it. She just had not known that until a cold November night when someone handed her an apron, and she finally understood that she did not have to take it, that she had never had to take it, that she was allowed to say no, that the door was unlocked, that it had always been unlocked. She pushed the pram forward. Oliver ran back to her, his stick in hand, already talking about something he had seen near the tree line. She listened. She listened with her whole self, the way he deserved, the way everyone she loved deserved from here on, because she understood now that her attention was not a resource to be given only after everyone else had taken what they needed. It was hers to give. She gave it. The path turned ahead of them. She did not know exactly where it went. She did not need to know exactly where it went. She had her children and her morning and her stick-examining boy and her fierce, small, opinionated daughter and the October light that was doing something beautiful with the trees. She had her people. She had herself. She had made a start. That was enough for now. That was more than enough.